So yeah, binish Melanie Yazi nisha. Sorry, it's really loud. Belagana nishlea the my skijni bashes chain Belagana dash chair the Tosoni dashanale. White cone chapter deshana. Nasha, sorry. So we're here today to protest, obviously, the escalation of Israeli violence, Israeli military violence, and state-sponsored violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, but especially in Gaza, where I believe even today they're continuing to wage airstrikes, primarily on civilians, in the name of catching Hamas extremists. But we all know that civilians are facing the largest casualties and vulnerabilities in terms of the recent airstrikes. But why this issue matters for Navajo people is that the Shelley administration, Ben Shelley, but also Desiree Tome, who's a key figure within the Shelley administration, have since, I believe, 2012, it might have been earlier, started to have negotiations and conversations with the state of Israel, but also Israeli agribusiness, about importing certain kinds of agricultural technologies to the Navajo Nation for farming purposes and for agricultural development, essentially for economic development schemes that are being promoted by the Shelley administration. Part of the problem with this, there are many problems with it, but the first is that there's no transparency around that developing relationship. Navajo people don't know. I think many Navajo people don't know that it's even happening. And it's actually been funded it's been funded exclusively by private interests that have no accountability to Navajo people, to Navajo code, to Navajo law, or to the Navajo governance system. And so one of the things that we're asking is that the Shelley administration be very honest and divulge the full extent of the relationship with Israel. And part of this is because there's a growing international movement coming from many different sectors of many societies across the world that are condemning Israel for its rampant and egregious human rights violations against Palestinians. And I have witnessed those human rights violations firsthand. I went to Palestine, the West Bank specifically, and a few places in Israel. If you don't know, Israel, the nation state, is separated from the West Bank. Even though the West Bank is subsumed, much like the Navajo Nation is, within the larger nation of Israel, the West Bank is its own distinct contiguous territory that's reserved for Palestinians. And so we spent about 10 days in Palestine. I went with several students, about 25 students and faculty from UNM. It was sponsored by American Studies and Anthropology at UNM in Albuquerque. And part of the reason why we went was to witness the occupation so that we could actually come back to the communities we're from and educate people about what's going on and why Palestinians really need our help. And when I say human rights violations, that's like something that a lot of people use, like a phrase, human rights. And I feel like we all kind of know what it means, but we don't really. And for me, what human rights means is that Palestinians should just be given the chance to live without violence, to exist without violence, and to have the basic ability, which violence does not allow them to be able to determine some sort of future for themselves. And they don't get that. Israel, there are troops constantly present in Palestinian communities. They raid homes. They force Palestinians through checkpoints constantly. Israel is funding and building a wall, much like the Berlin Wall, but even larger and thousands of miles, so much more extensive, around the West Bank that encroaches into homes. It bisects Palestinian business districts. It bisects whole cities. Bethlehem itself, where I actually got this scarf, and it's a Palestinian-owned business in Bethlehem, used to be on a really busy Palestinian business district. And on purpose, in order to dismantle Palestinians' ability to have viable economies, much like I think what we struggle with here in the Navajo Nation, they built the wall directly down the middle of that street in Bethlehem. And so now it's a desert. I mean, you can actually see tumbleweeds just kind of going across the street. And so Palestinians are also very poor because of the occupation. And so this wall is also manned by gun towers that are at intervals, at very regular intervals. And these gun towers are tall. I'd say they're about 100 feet tall. And they're armed by troops with guns. And so there's always a gun scope on you, as the other thing in the West Bank. If there's not a camera that's surveilling your activity, there's a drone or there's a gun scope. And so Palestinians live under these conditions every day. They're refugees in their own homelands. Many Palestinians live in refugee camps that don't look like the refugee camps we usually identify when we see images of Africa, for example. These refugee camps have actually been in existence for over 60 years, and so they're now permanent ghettos. within the West Bank. And Palestinians were displaced there in order for Israel to come into existence as a state in 1948, and they were put into these refugee camps with the promise that some sort of negotiation would ensue where they could return to their homes or they could find a new home. And Israel has never let them actually find a new home. So they're literally prisoners and refugees in their own homeland. So that's another aspect of the occupation. The final, most egregious aspect of the occupation are settlements. And settlements are essentially, if you can think, if there's like a hill and there's a condominium, a white condominium city that can populate 50 to 70,000 people, this is what I mean by settlements. And there are dozens of settlements that are actively built on Palestinian land in the West Bank illegally. I mean, they cross the border that was established in 1948 when Israel became a state and agreed to designate the West Bank for what is now known as the West Bank for Palestinians exclusively. And so the settlements are actually inside the West Bank borders. And they pump raw sewage directly into Palestinian farms and make it yet again impossible for Palestinians to have any form of sort of sustainable economic practice. And the settlements the vast majority of settlements aren't even populated by people, so they're just empty. They're just these empty cities in the sky. So the specific purpose of settlements in the West Bank are to, A, make it impossible for Palestinians to be able to live in the West Bank. So Israel really just wants Palestinians to go away. That's part of what this is about. But it also means that Israel is laying claim to land that Israel thinks belongs to Israel. And the fact that there are still Palestinians there means that they have to eradicate the Palestinian presence in order for Israel to claim the West Bank, which they very much want to do. They want that territory, again, much like the United States, I think would really love to have treaty land, for example, that Native people reside on here in the US. And the settlements are also populated by religious extremists that they usually import from the United States, believe it or not. So they're usually US Jews who are rampant Zionists, who, because of their religious extremism, are often incredibly racist against Palestinians. And the settlements themselves are also fortified. Sometimes they have walls around them. Usually they have like electric fences. There are also troops that are constantly manning the boundaries of settlements. And the whole narrative behind this, from the State of Israel, from Zionist sympathizers, is that we have to protect Jews from terrorist attacks from Palestinians. So we're building a wall around them in order to prevent this, which doesn't make any sense to me. That seems like a crime. I mean, it seems like a crime to respond to a people who are completely desperate to keep what little they have left of their own homelands, and who are willing to fight and engage in armed resistance. I mean, Native people did this, you know, when the US was actively trying to conquer and take our land and kill us. I mean, I don't really understand why people don't see the comparisons with Palestinians. And again, this is an active colonial presence right now. So this isn't like something that happened in history, like in Africa, or the fact that we're in, you know, sort of a post-wartime state here in the United States as Native people. Palestinians are dealing with an active war against them. And so it only makes sense for them to engage in warfare with Israel, which has more money, more people, more international support, etc. And so the occupation itself is so violent and so all-consuming. You can just feel it when you're there. I was trying to describe it to some friends last night who are actually asking me about it. They said, so how did you feel? And I said, I don't even know if I had emotions. I don't even know if I had physical response. All I know is that it completely eliminates your ability to have a voice. It eliminates your ability to have agency. And it's like static around you, especially because you're constantly surveilled. And so I think that particular kind of violence is really unique to the Palestine situation. But I think it's also very telling and also pretty typical of all colonial situations. And the US is very similar in a lot of ways. I think the circumstances have just shifted because of our own unique history. And so I could not come back from that trip. And I went there because I wanted to understand colonization in other parts of the world, not just the United States, so it could inform my work against colonization and colonialism here on behalf of Navajo people, because these are my people, these are my homelands. I love this place, and I want to protect it to the greatest extent possible. And so I couldn't come back from my trip to Palestine and not do anything. What I saw was so utterly disturbing that I've been speaking up about it ever since. So I was on that trip 3 years ago, and I've been writing and talking and educating. I include it in the classes I teach, for example, at UNM and IAIA. So that was really long-winded, but I want people to know, what the situation is about.
So what do you want the people to do?
So I think in order for people, Navajo people, to do anything, they have to be informed about what's going on. So the things that I just described, for example, just basic information about the history of the occupation, just basic information about what the violence is really like on a day-to-day basis for Palestinians, and the reason why it matters to Navajos. And so once they feel informed enough about that, they also need to get information from the Shelley administration about what exactly is going on in this partnership with Israel. Because again, it's basically been a lobbying effort on the part of private entities, and it's been largely, withheld, I would say, from the Navajo public. And so they need to be educated about the situation. They need to be educated about the actual relationship that exists now between the Navajo Nation and Israel in order to come to a decision. And we are hoping to have a referendum in November for the general election. But we want Navajo people to be able to decide on this issue themselves. And for me, the reason why I care a lot and why I think it does matter immensely to Navajo people is because our reputation, actually, as a sovereign entity in the world, is really on the line with this issue. There are a lot of people watching. There's already been criticism, actually, about the Navajo partnership with Israel. There are people watching what we do about this issue and where we stand on it. Will we stand with war criminals, or will we stand with people who are oppressed and we want to assist with their liberation? And so I think that's really what's at stake. Our reputation and our definition as a sovereign entity, who we are as the people, and what kind of values do we have as a nation of Indigenous people. So we want people to be educated, to educate themselves, and to voice their perspective, and then to vote. And to take a stand. This really requires you to take a stand.